Okay, good morning. Thank you. I get a little stage fright, so I have some notes with me just to keep me on track. So thank you for understanding. So in my 9 to 5 Monday through Friday work, I talk a lot with doctors about ADD and ADHD. I work with over 150 doctors. And today I would like to share with you some information that I hope will be useful. How many of you here are familiar with ADD and ADHD? Great, okay. So just to start with a very quick definition, ADD is defined as a problem of inattention with periods of hyperactivity. Sound familiar? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about who is affected by ADD and ADHD. The American psychiatric community states that between 3 and 7% of school-age children have a diagnosis of ADD, ADHD. And parents report that school-age children between the ages of 4 and 17 have 9.5% of children have ever had a diagnosis of ADD, ADHD. And that amounts to 5.5 million children in our country. I think that figure is astonishing. 5.5 million children have that diagnosis. And it has grown from 2003 to 2007 by 22%. Yeah, wow. That is huge. So do you think that ADD, ADHD is a fairly common problem? Yeah, it's definitely a very common problem. So I want to help you understand how the central nervous system relates to focus and concentration. So we're going to spend some time today talking about the central nervous system, what we call the master controller. So the central nervous system controls every action in your body. It's responsible for innervating every cell, tissue, and organ in your body. And it is responsible for all of the actions that are what we call autonomic. So autonomic actions happen automatically. We don't have to think about them. So that includes things like breathing. We don't think about breathing. It includes things like digestion. Digestion happens automatically. You can stand on your head and your digestion will still happen. It involves sleeping. We don't think about sleeping. Our body knows how to go to sleep. It also controls emotions. And with ADHD children, we see a lot of problems and issues with emotions and behaviors. And it also controls learning and our ability to learn. So can I see a show of hands of anybody who's familiar with the term neurotransmitter? Okay, good, excellent. So our body controls everything that goes on with these little chemical signals called neurotransmitters. And if we look at the central nervous system as a whole, it sort of acts like a parent in that it lends a great deal of support to the way that our hormones work and to the way that our immune system works. So in order to achieve and maintain optimal health, we need to have the nervous system be in the dominant position. So neurotransmitters are a doorway that you can work through to help balance the whole body, because they control every function, they control every cell and tissue in your entire body. So the ability to focus is a function that's performed by our brains. And the brain uses these little chemical signals, neurotransmitters, to talk to itself and to maintain focus and concentration. If you have imbalances in those little chemical signals, then it will drive symptoms of ADD and ADHD. And studies suggest that over 80% of the American population has neurotransmitter imbalances. Can I see, has anyone had their neurotransmitters checked? No, of course not. How do we do that? Yeah, and we'll come back to that. Yeah, and I'll help you with that. So imbalances in neurotransmitters can drive really serious health concerns. So if you think about the nervous system as the master controller with these little chemical signals, neurotransmitters, that really are responsible for everything that happens in you. And you think about that nervous system as having some parental controls to help support the way your hormones work and the way your immune system works. It seems to me like it's a pretty powerful system in your body, don't you think? Okay. So, excuse me, there's that little stage right there. I want to talk about the most common complaints that people experience. Having said that imbalances in neurotransmitters can drive some pretty serious health problems, people have self-reported that have had their neurotransmitters checked. These are the most common complaints that people have self-reported. Lack of focus. And we're not just talking about children. We're talking about children and adults. Lack of ability to concentrate. Lack of motivation. Fatigue. Low mood. Difficulties with sleep, getting to sleep, staying asleep, and difficulties with weight. Any of this sound familiar? Yeah? Yeah, of course it does. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit now about what's out there for people who are experiencing some of these common complaints that I just mentioned in terms of support. What's out there for people who have a diagnosis of ADD and ADHD? We have medications, right? We have medications that are stimulants and non-stimulants. And anyone who has a child or a family member who has a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD is probably familiar with some of those stimulant medications, things like Adderall. There's some behavioral therapy to help children particularly behave better in school. There's some educational support and support for parents to learn how to parent a child who has ADD, ADHD. That's not really very much, is it, in terms of support and help? And is it working? Okay, no. And so I want to share with you some information from a very prominent psychiatrist who is working in a very integrative way with his patients, and he's published a beautiful book called The ADHD Medication Rules, and it's subtitled Paying Attention to the Meds for Paying Attention. He's a wonderful man. I've had the pleasure of meeting him. His name is Charles Parker. And this is some excerpts from his book that I feel really spell out the problem. So he says, ADD, ADHD medications will not correct depleted neurotransmitters, malnutrition, immune dysfunction, hormone dysregulation, and toxicity. So how are people who are experiencing these common complaints and concerns of neurotransmitter imbalances going to get better if this is a dynamic problem? Sleep patterns, nutritional status, hormone dysregulation, neurotransmitter imbalances all contribute to ADD, ADHD symptoms. So it seems to me this is a very complex issue, that having simply medications and some forms of behavioral and parenting therapy may not be enough to really help people get well. So I want to talk a little bit about what the major contributors are to ADHD and ADD symptoms. So we have three major components that contribute to these symptoms. One is stress, two is diet, and three is toxins. We heard a little bit about that, a couple of those topics with the last speaker. So stress from any source over time leads to neurotransmitter imbalances and dysfunction, brain dysfunction. Stress from any source over time. Now that's a pretty broad statement because we have a lot of sources of stress in our life, don't we? And we have to deal with those sources of stress for long periods of time. And our children are also having to deal with a lot more stress in their lives compared to our lives or our parents' lives. Life has become more complex. And children are far more overstimulated in their lives than we ever were or our parents ever were. And that is a major source of stress. So the key is to help the brain and the body to adapt to stress in a more healthful way over the course of a lifetime. And stress is a huge category of focal area for me in my work. I'm also a certified nutritionist, because I feel if we can do a lot to help people balance and manage the stressors in their lives, both psychologically and physiologically, that a lot of people get a lot better, wouldn't you say? So stress is huge. And then emotional, psychological sources of stress are also huge because they create the same vicious cycle in the body as something like a food or a toxin. Diet is the second biggest source of imbalances that drive ADD and ADHD symptoms. And there's over 35 years of research to back up that food intolerances drive symptoms of ADD and ADHD. And some of the most common foods, which a few were mentioned before, egg, peanut, dairy, but also in soy, but also wheat and chocolate. These are major, major categories of food that cause intolerances in the immune system and drive symptoms, particularly of hyperactivity in children. Dysbiosis is another major problem with hyperactivity and attention deficit in children, particularly dysbiosis being defined as an overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria in the small intestine. And particularly vulnerable are children who have had multiple rounds of antibiotics early in life. Does that sound familiar? Okay. Major problem. And fatty acid deficiencies. Fats are a major, major nutrient needed for proper nervous system signaling because they line every single cell of your body and promote proper nervous system signaling. So fatty acid deficiencies, things like fish oils. And other nutrient deficiencies that can drive symptoms of ADD involve minerals. And we're not really in the habit of thinking about minerals on a daily basis, are we? How many of you think about minerals every day? Okay, couple. Mineral deficiencies are a major source of symptoms of ADD and ADHD. So we need to have a gut that's working right in order to be able to absorb minerals into the body and support the nervous system. Okay, and toxins. We heard the previous doctor talk about some of those toxins that interrupt immune function. They also interfere with nervous system function. That can be solvents in your house, any kind of chemicals, toxic metals, of course, anything that's coming into the body from the outside world that doesn't belong in it is a toxin. So let me ask, how do we determine if our brain is sending those messages and signals properly? How do we make that determination, and how do we specifically identify where those imbalances are? Anybody have any ideas? That's the problem. But there is an answer, and we're going to come on to that. So there's an old saying that goes like this: if you don't know what you're looking for, you probably aren't going to find it. And that's the problem with ADD and ADHD. We don't know what we're looking for. So how are we going to find it? It's kind of like a dartboard. Throwing darts at somebody when you don't know what the target is a bit futile. So Dr. Parker has a couple of other words of wisdom for us in his book. And I really love what he says here because these are bold statements. He says, treating ADD and ADHD without first establishing targeted outcomes is a bit like playing basketball without hoops. A lot of running around and no clear direction. And I thought, boy, that really resonated with me. That was just perfect. he said, when it comes to ADD and ADHD, everyone is an expert. And unreliable gossip sets the standard of care. And that basically speculation rules far too often. I think that's a pretty bold statement for a psychiatrist to make. And he's really stepped out of the box. So what do we need to do? We need to look at biochemistry. Biochemistry is that path that's going to help us see what those targets are. So where's the best place to start? How about that master controller we referred to earlier, the central nervous system? The central nervous system I liken a little bit to a car. It has a gas pedal and it has a brake. So what happens if you push on the gas pedal and there's no gas in the tank? What do you think is going to happen? No focus, no concentration, no motivation. We call that neurotransmitter depletion. There's no fuel to work the nervous system. What happens if you push on the gas all the time? What's going to happen? Hyperactivity, behavioral issues. That's going to go on until what? You run out of gas. And then what's going to happen? It becomes a vicious cycle. Then you're not going to have any gas in the tank. And in the process of all this, you're just going to burn up the brakes. Does that make sense? Okay. So the key is balance in that master controller, in the central nervous system, and regulation. So we talked earlier about the autonomic processes. Breathing, sleeping, digestion, all those are autonomic processes. We want to have a nervous system that allows us to go when we push on the gas and stop when we push on the brakes, and be able to stop and focus and concentrate on whatever's in front of us without creating more stress. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be great for our kids? Yeah. Okay, so we talked a little bit earlier about those little chemical signals called neurotransmitters. Anybody want to take just a wild guess at how many neurotransmitters are involved in ADD and ADHD symptoms? There's about 8 of them. There's about 8 of them. So how do we know what to target if we can't see it? We don't. So we're going to start throwing darts. That's part of the problem. So did you know that you can actually test for them? How many of you knew that there's a neurotransmitter test on the market? Okay. 1, 2, 3 people. Okay, good. So there is a test on the market that allows you to look at that autonomic regulation of the gas tank in the braking system. And it's a simple test that's a urine sample. And you collect it second morning urine, fasting test. It's a kit. You take it home and you do the sample at home. It has everything in it that you need to run the test at home and send it into the lab. And what it does is it allows your healthcare provider to be able to look at the autonomic regulation of your nervous system, identify specifically those targets that are involved in ADD and ADHD, and then create a customized plan for your nervous system to help strengthen that regulation so you can go when you push on the gas and stop when you push on the brakes. It allows you to see specific problems that are driving symptoms. Some of those things we mentioned earlier: lack of focus, lack of concentration, lack of motivation, hyperactivity. And you can directly intervene. And whether a healthcare provider intervenes with medication or whether they intervene otherwise, you can get a much better result. So you don't need to have a psychiatrist to run the test for you. This test is one of the most important missing links in healthcare today. And I work with a very brilliant German biochemist who has developed this test and made it available to acupuncturists, chiropractors, naturopathic doctors, nurse practitioners, medical doctors, and nutritionists. And I want to close by saying that there's also a natural way to provide therapy, and that is through targeted amino acid therapy. So medications are not the only route to balancing the nervous system. You can also balance them through targeted amino acid therapy, and the test results allow you to target those neurotransmitters and apply the targeted amino acid therapy to them specifically to provide that balance to the nervous system. Okay, so the targeted amino acid therapy is going to reset and restore the balance in the autonomic nervous system. I've left some information at the speakers table for you with a spec sheet on a specific test and a flyer on neurotransmitter testing. And there's 2 ways in which you can go about finding how to run the test. One, Dr. Leslie Hewitt runs the test. 2, if you don't live in the area, you can call the number on the literature and they will refer you to a healthcare provider in your area who does. Thank you very much.